Please open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 7. I can't emphasize it enough. I know I can sound like a nag sometimes about these things, that it's important to actually open our Bibles when we go to a Bible study. So whether you're sitting here watching this on your computer or on your TV screen, whether you're sitting in the sanctuary, it seems easy enough. We walk in, we sit down, and we watch the guy talk. And I understand all that. But what God does when we have an open Bible in front of us, and when we can actually see the words, and frankly, with a pen in hand, so that we can write notes, whether in a notebook or in the margins of our Bible, to highlight things, to underline things, because God wants to speak to us. And this is especially important stuff that we're looking at here tonight. I said earlier that as we look at chapter 7, you can call this Daniel's vision, today's news, or Daniel's vision, today's headlines. The first six, the book of Daniel is 12 chapters long. He didn't write them as chapters, of course. The chapter and verse divisions were put in the 12th and 13th centuries. But the first 6 chapters are narrative for us, and it's exciting. I think we're all excited about going through the book of Daniel. It's definitely one of my favorite books of the Bible. Now as we come to chapter 7, there are narrative aspects of it, no doubt, but it's heavy laden with prophetic information, things that God really wants us to understand about his plans, about the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, and in this chapter, what he's doing in world governments. Now, we're going to see one aspect of that here, but as we move along, especially as we come to chapter 9 later on, and chapter 10, to see who's behind the scenes of these world governments, it really helps to clarify the news that we watch on TV or that we read, for those of us who still read newspapers or wherever you get your news. So we come to this, and I should stop preambling and just dive right in, I guess. We read this, beginning here in verse 1. We read that in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while he was on his bed. Okay, let's stop for a minute. So as we went from chapter 1 to chapter 6, it was all not only narrative, but it was chronological, right? Daniel's a 12 to 14-year-old middle schooler, we'll call him, when he's taken captive from Jerusalem. We finished up chapter 6 on Sunday. He's an 83 or an 84-year-old man. So everything moved in pretty clear chronological order. Now we come to the prophetic aspects, and it's not in chronological order per se. And I'm not going to worry about defending any of that or explaining it. You can just read it for yourself and see. But now as we open up chapter 7, we see that what we're about to look at is the summary of a dream and visions that Daniel received during the first year of Belshazzar. So, Belshazzar, we read about him in chapter 5. In Belshazzar's great party, the orgy, whatever you want to call it, where God writes on the wall, many, many tekel upharsin, right, all that. Belshazzar, I always say that. Belshazzar was just a spoiled brat king, grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. So this is occurring in probably about 553 BC. It may or may not make a difference to you. The fall of Babylon occurs, chapter 5, and 539 BC. So this is the first year of Belshazzar, so roughly 553 BC. Or, if you want to look at it this way, somewhere between chapter 4 and chapter 5 of Daniel. That's where you would place this. Daniel says he had a dream and he had visions. I'm going to read it through to a certain point, and then we're going to come back and we're going to look at it. And I'm going to tell you in advance, we're not doing the whole chapter tonight, so don't get too worried as the time starts to wear on. You're going to think, my word, how late is he going to go? I'm not. We're not going to be too ambitious about this, but let's read it through first, okay? So in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while he was on his bed. And then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts, or your Bible may say, giving the sum of the matter, or basically you'd say he gave the high points, or he gave an outline here. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear, was raised up on one side, and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh. And after this I looked, and there was another, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful, terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. And I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up from among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. And I watched until thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. And I watched them because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched till the beast was slain, and its body was destroyed and given to the burning flame. And as for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, and yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, all nations, and all languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. And I was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. So I came near to one of those, or an angel, who stood by, and I asked him the truth of all this. And he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. He said, Those great beasts which are 4 kings, which will arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom, and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. And I wish to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron, nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. And the 10 horns which were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth, which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints, and prevailing against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. I'm going to stop there, even though you should read it for yourself. But in consideration of what we're going to try to accomplish tonight, I'm going to stop there. And I think we will all admit that's a really weird dream. You know it's a really weird dream. You can say, well, it's in the Bible. Things can be strange sometimes. Oh, no. Even for things in the Bible, even where prophecy is concerned in general in the Bible, that's a really weird dream. I mean, you want to think sometimes if you had a dream like that, that kind of freak you out. You look at those beasts, you're thinking, I don't know if it was the pizza I ate too late before I went to bed. I don't know what it is, but I am freaked out, and I'm going to sleep with the lights on. Very, very strange dream. In fact, it's interesting to me that Daniel wants to know what this is all about. We read in, verse 12, or rather 15. He says he was grieved, and so he went to one who stood by, and he wanted to know, who are these beasts? And the angel says to him in verse 17, yeah, these are these are three kings, or three kingdoms. They're kind of equal. In Aramaic or Hebrew, a king and his kingdom are equivalent in one sense. So basically saying, yeah, these are three kingdoms that are going to arise, and then they're going to go away. Like, there's a lot here to ask about, and yet the angel says, yeah, there are three kingdoms that'll rise up, and then they'll go away. Doesn't give any more information than that. When he asks about the fourth one, he asks actually a pretty long question. If you go back and look at it, it's a pretty long way of answering the question. The angel might have forgotten some of the things that Daniel was even asking. And when he asked them, that's when the angel gives them even more information. Now, the question is, what is this all about? So we're going to try to walk our way through. As I mentioned earlier, we're not going to try to get too ambitious tonight. We'll do this in two parts. So we'll do this tonight, and we'll do it on Wednesday. I'm not going to handle this per se, or at least not in this way, on a Sunday morning. And I'm going to do my best not to get technical, because to some degree you can get technical, and it can be very accurate technical, and where we need to, I'll go there. But I want us to not lose the scope of what this is all about. And sometimes when we get too technical, we can lose that scope because we kind of drill down a little bit too far. I know I'm guilty of that at times, so I want to be careful about this. There is a concept which I don't think we've spoken enough about here at Calvary, or at least in terms of my teaching. So I want to be sure that we understand it. Jesus, in his Mount of Olives, or his Olivet Discourse, he's on the Mount of Olives. It's just a few days before he'll be crucified. And he's having a private briefing with Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And they want to know, when is all this going to happen? Jesus had said that, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, and that not one stone is going to be left on another. He said all of this on the day of the triumphal entry, or we call it Palm Sunday. And they want to know, well, when is this going to happen? What are the signs that this is going to happen? And Jesus talks about these things. You'll find them in Matthew chapter 24 and 25, but we'll say chapter 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. But specifically in Luke 21, verse 24, Jesus says something that's very important for us to understand. He uses a phrase there. And he says, Luke 21, 24. If you don't know it already, mark it down. Luke 21, 24, Jesus says that Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Key phrase, the times of the Gentiles. Jerusalem, he says, will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles has been fulfilled. Now, up until that point, Jerusalem has not been trampled on by the Gentiles. Within recent history of the time that Jesus was speaking, Israel had been back in the land for the last 200 years easily, more than that, but the great diaspora is going to occur in 70 A.D. He's speaking in 32 A.D. and he's telling his disciples that Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles has been fulfilled. I know, John, you've only said it 4 times already. Exactly. I want you to remember it. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles, he said, until the time of the Gentiles has been fulfilled. Key phrase, time of the Gentiles. What is that? Okay, I'll explain in a moment, but now let's go to another phrase, which we often can get confused with. It's an entirely different topic, but Paul the Apostle says this in Romans 11:25. He's talking about Israel. He says, I don't want you to be ignorant of the mystery regarding Israel, the role of Israel. And actually, Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11, those 3 chapters taken together, is Paul explaining that God has a plan for Israel. And he says, this is important, Romans 11:25, he says, don't be wise in your own opinion of things, because blindness, in part, has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Now, it sounds like we're talking about the same thing, the fullness of the Gentiles and the times of the Gentiles. Very quickly, because it's not highly relevant to what we're going to look at tonight, but Romans 11:25, when Paul is talking about the fullness of the Gentiles coming in, he's speaking of the salvation that, the gospel's gone out to all the world, that all may come in. Remember, Jesus is a Jewish Messiah. He came first to Israel. Israel has rejected him, though, his disciples were Jewish. I mean, so many Jews were saved there in those early days, and still today. But the Gentiles is a much greater, by far, percentage of the world population. And for the most part, the church has been identified with the Gentiles over these last 2,000 years. And Paul's actually making reference there to the rapture of the church. And he's saying to the Gentiles, don't think that you're so smart, and don't think that God has rejected Israel, because Israel has been blinded by God in part, until a certain point, until the fullness of the Gentiles have come into the church. He's not saying until every Gentile is saved. God has a plan. He's saying at the point of the rapture, there is a certain number, you might say, of Gentiles who are going to be raptured. After that, the rapture occurs. And then something new begins. It's still salvation, but the church is gone. The church has gone to heaven. That's the fullness of the Gentiles. We can talk about that another time. If you have a question, feel free to email. And we'll go into it another time. But the times of the Gentiles, now that's different. What is it? It's important we understand it as we look at this passage here tonight. The times of the Gentiles actually began when Nebuchadnezzar became the king. So in 605 BC, we'll call it Daniel chapter 1, right? When Nebuchadnezzar comes and takes Daniel and his friends, the best and the brightest, he takes them off as captives. Nebuchadnezzar makes 3 attacks on Jerusalem. That's the beginning of the times of the Gentiles. In other words, from Israel's perspective, God has given dominion over to the Gentiles. Because of Israel's sin, because of Judah's sin, God has given them into the hands of the Gentiles. And so from that point, 605 BC, forward, the times of the Gentiles has begun. Then in 32 AD, where Jesus is speaking on the Mount of Olives, he's saying this trampling down of Jerusalem is going to continue until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. When is that? Well, I'm not going to go into all of that tonight, but many will say, that, the time of the Gentiles was fulfilled in 1967 or 1948 when when Israel came into the land, back into the land. No, that's not true. Some say the time of the Gentiles was fulfilled, completed when Israel took Jerusalem, their ancient capital, when they took that, June 6, 1967, or June 7, 1967. And people have all kinds of ideas of when it was fulfilled. And I'll tell you, and this is certainly my opinion, and we can support this biblically, the times of the Gentiles has not yet been fulfilled. Israel is in the land, but they really don't know the Lord. They know their strength. They don't know the Lord. And so as we look at this prophecy that we're about to look at, this all deals with God working behind the scenes in creating these major empires, major kingdoms that will have dominion on planet Earth during this period called the time of the Gentiles, until the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, his second coming. Now, the question is, or actually let me step back half a step. We've seen 4 beasts here. Daniel has described for us 4 images that he received by way of a dream and multiple visions. And he refers to these things that he's seen as beasts, that they're kingdoms, but they're portrayed as beasts. Now, when I first, or earlier days when I was saved and I began to show a real interest in prophecy, was a time when most people interpreted this passage different than a lot of people are interpreting it today. And we always want to be careful about how changes in interpretations occur. But let me just give you this. I've probably used this illustration a few times in the past, but I remember, in my earlier days, I lived in Colorado, but my home was New Jersey. And so I had left home with all of my earthly possessions stuffed in the back of my 64 Nova, and I drove away in 1972, and I drove off to Colorado. And multiple times I made that trip. I know I-80 pretty well. And, it's an interesting thing. You drive through Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Iowa and eastern Nebraska, even western Nebraska, and you really don't see much but, corn and wheat and soy and a few cows here and there, but it's basically flatlands. And you don't see much of anything else. Beautiful country, huge country, gorgeous. But an interesting thing happens when you get to eastern Colorado. You see this thin little strip. It's almost a purple strip along the western horizon. And for a while, you wonder if your eyes are playing games with you. You realize those are the Rocky Mountains. And as you get closer to Denver or to what we call the Front Range, that strip is growing bigger and bigger on the horizon. In fact, as you get closer, you begin to say, oh, there's a little white cap along there. Yeah, that's the Continental Divide. That's, that's above tree line. It's just, if you love the mountains, it's exciting to see those things. And you think you understand the mountains from that distance. You can even get to Denver. And they're clear on a clear day, or if you're near Colorado Springs on a clear day, wow, you see Pikes Peak and all that, or you can see pretty far in, but you don't even know how far in you're seeing into the mountains. You think you really start to get definition of the mountains until you start going up the highway on up into the mountains. And then you realize, what you saw from Denver was actually 70 miles away. And those mountains are enormous. They're getting bigger and bigger. You don't see the detail, quite obviously, until you're right up near it. Prophecy can be like that. So there's certain aspects of prophecy sometimes we need to be careful that we're not too dogmatic about. God gives us the general theme. It's as we get closer, God's prophecy, his plan, as he reveals it, is the word would be progressive. He shows us a little bit, then he shows us a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. Many people have said, I've certainly said it to you a number of times, you cannot understand the book of Revelation. People say, I know. Oh man, it's nothing but symbols. Well, okay, yeah, it's full of symbols. But the thing is that the symbols that you're reading are all found. It's a language. A language is symbols, right? Words are symbols. They represent something. And the same thing with the Word of God, meaning prophetic aspect. There are things that God may have said thousands of years before Christ came. Or he might have said 1,000 or 500 years before John wrote the book of Revelation down. And God uses the things that he gave us in his word, and I'll say in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. And he uses that as his language or the vocabulary that he uses in the book of Revelation. A number of times, I think I've said, there are 404 verses in the book of Revelation. And yet, in those 404 verses, there are over 800 references, symbols, types, allusions, metaphors, similes, things like that, that are all found in the Old Testament. So if you don't read your Old Testament, you're kind of lost when you get to the book of Revelation. You get very confused. You throw up your hands. It's nothing but symbols. Of course it's symbols. But the vocabulary is all there for you to understand if you read your Old Testament, and especially if you read the book of Daniel. You can't really understand the fullness of the book of Revelation unless you understand what is being given to us through Daniel's prophecies. Okay, so all that to say then, now we get to this whole matter of, well then, what is it that God is speaking to Daniel here in these dreams and visions? And what is it that he wants us to understand? And so I'm going to tell you right off the bat that some very, very good scholars, just guys like Walvoord and John Walvoord, people like that, the classic interpretation that they have offered of these prophecies tends to be, and some people are recalibrating, but the classic interpretation that they have is that, well, what Daniel was given in chapter 7 is God's perspective on the very same kingdoms that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about in Daniel chapter 2. Very quickly, if you recall, Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 of Daniel, he's inherited the kingdom from his father who has died, and he has all these wise men, and he's going to test them because he doesn't know if he can really trust these guys. They're supposed to be able to interpret dreams. So Neb has had a very disturbing dream, and so he says to his wise men, I've had a dream, can't remember it. So he lied to them. He said, I can't remember it, but I want you to tell me what it is and then interpret it for me. And of course, they go back and forth. They try to say, no sweat, Neb, just tell us what you dreamed and we'll tell you what it meant. He said, no. If you don't tell me what it is, I'm going to take off your head and make your house a dunghill. So there's an incentive, get to it. They're not able. He gives the order for them to die. And Daniel learns about it, and he said, not so fast. My God can do this. And so that's what chapter 2 is all about. And I think you know that. And so Neb has had this dream in which he has seen a great image of a man that has a head of gold, that has a chest and arms made of silver, a belly and thighs of bronze, and then 2 legs extending down to the feet of iron. And of course, down at the feet themselves, the toes are iron mixed with clay. Okay, so there are actually 4 kingdoms, even though it sounds like 5. It's 4 kingdoms. I'm not going to go into that. You can go back and listen to the CD on that. But in any event, do we actually have CDs anymore? Anyhow, you can listen to that. But many people will say that, well, the 4 kingdoms that we see here, the 3 followed by the great and terrible 4th one, are the very same kingdoms as the ones that Nebuchadnezzar saw back there in chapter 2. And that Neb saw them in terms of their value, gold, and silver, and bronze, and in terms of their power and strength and all that. God portrayed them in the way he sees the kingdoms of man, which is in the form of beasts. And hey, there's a lot to be said about that. But as we look at some of the particular points here, and like I said, I'm not going to drill down too far and get real technical, but if you look at some of these things, I'll try to give you the basic points. So take notes, because I think it's helpful in terms of interpreting all of this. But the answer is no, probably not. These are probably different kingdoms. Now, some of you may be getting disturbed already about that, but let's try to walk through. Okay. So, we read that in the first year of Belshazzar, Daniel had a dream and he had these visions. And they were very disturbing to him. And he says, I'm going to give you the summary of them. I'll tell you the basics of what I have seen here. He said, I saw in my vision, he says here in verse 2, that there were 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. The great sea, when it pertains to Israel, the Great Sea is a phrase that refers to the Mediterranean. If you've gone to Israel or if you've studied Israel at all, there are actually 4 seas. One of them is actually a lake, the Sea of Galilee, but they call it a sea. The others are the Mediterranean, the Red Sea down in the south, and the Dead Sea. So the Med, the Red, the Dead, and the Sea of Galilee. And so some people say this is the Mediterranean. No, that's probably not so. This is an image used, and it's also used over in Revelation. The Great Sea is also portrayed very often as the multitude of the populations of the Gentile world. The 4 winds of heaven are stirring up. In other words, there's this stirring going on in all of society, and there's a what's the word I'm looking for? But this great disturbance happening. That's what he's seeing, that the winds are disturbing the people of the earth, and as a result of that, we see these 4 kingdoms that are now arising. before we go further, there is one thing I want to mention to some of you, all of you. And to some of you, you're going to think, oh, that just sounds like homework. I don't want to do that. Others, I hope you'll find this interesting enough to track down. We have this tendency to think that when, we read in chapter 5, the fall of Babylon, right? When in Belshazzar's party, where God writes on the wall, your days are numbered, you're a lightweight, and you're finished here. And the Medes and the Persians conquer Babylon. They did conquer Babylon. We have a tendency to think that Babylon was destroyed. Not so. Do not confuse. This is really important when you read the Bible as a whole and when you read prophecy specifically. Do not confuse the fall of Babylon in October of 539 BC, the end of the kingdom of Babylon. Do not confuse that with what some passages may refer to as the doom of Babylon or the destruction of Babylon. The city of Babylon was just simply taken by the Persians. It was their capital, their western capital for a while. Later on, when Alexander the Great conquers, he's in Babylon. In fact, he even dies in Babylon later on in 332 BC. So the other thing that's really important to remember is that Babylon is not just a physical kingdom that ruled for a while, but the philosophies of Babylon, the financial principles that govern much of our world today, the whole idea of interest rates and buying a house with a mortgage or buying a car, the idea of keeping people in debt as a form of slavery, so to speak. This all comes out of Babylon in the first place. So the philosophies, many of the philosophies and the principles of Babylon are still ruling the world in many ways today. So for those of you interested, there are 6 chapters I recommend that you read, and then in this order. It'll take you about 45 minutes. Try to do it in one sitting. Isaiah 13 and 14, Jeremiah 50 and 51, and Revelation 17 and 18. And as you read them, you'll see that the destruction of Babylon cannot occur until the last days, the days in which we're living right now, and literally at the very end. In fact, when you get to the end of chapter 18 in Revelation, and you'll see that there's rejoicing in heaven. Babylon is fallen. No longer will they enslave the people. That idea. So the Bible, some people have said, but I think it's worth our while to remember it this way, the Bible is in many ways a tale of two cities, a tale of Babylon and Jerusalem, and the ideas and the principles and the God who rules and overrules. Okay? So I say that to you. I hope that's helpful. Now let's look at this. Daniel sees in his dream and his visions the 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea, I should say. And he says, verse 3, that 4 great beasts came up from the sea, or came up from the multitude of the Gentile nations. Remember, all the nations of the world are Gentiles. Gentile is just a word in English that comes from the Hebrew word goyim. A goy is a nation. Goyim, it's a plural, nations. And there's Israel, and then there's all the goyim, all the nations, all the Gentiles, okay? So what we're being told here is that from the multitude of these nations now arises these 4 beasts. Again, some will say that these are the same nations or the same kingdoms that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream. And as we walk through this, I hope I'm able to show you, no, that's not true. So as we do this, let's see, they're all beasts. These 4 kingdoms are portrayed as beasts. Notice these beasts are predators. You can just see a lion, a bear, a leopard. They're predators. And the 4th beast, which was like indescribable to him. He says, I had this dream at night, he says in verse 2. At night. It kind of reminds me, John says in Revelation chapter 1, he says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. And some people will say, see, it was Sunday and he was praying. That's probably not what he meant by that. What he probably meant by that is in the Spirit, God took him prophetically or by vision into a period of time the Bible refers to as the day of the Lord. And he saw the unfolding of the day of the world, the day of the Lord. He saw the unfolding of the day of the Lord. And so here he is now seeing these things at night. It's important for us, but Paul says, 1 Thessalonians 5, that we're all children, you and I as Christians. We're believers in the Lord Jesus Christ. He's the light of the world. We're children of the light. We're not pagans. We're not the children of the darkness. But it's from the darkness. It's from the great multitude of all the Gentiles that these dark kingdoms arise. Now, I'm going to tell you here, I'm going to try to summarize them before we get into these themselves. These first three beasts are often portrayed as, verse 4, he says, I saw a beast that looked like a lion but had eagle's wings. And many will say, and with some truth to it, that a symbol for Babylon was the winged lion. So many will simply conclude, so that's a picture of Babylon, just as that's what the head of gold was in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Or let's just skip down very quickly to the second beast was like a bear, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth. People say, see, that's a picture of the Medes and the Persians. And in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he saw a chest and arms of silver. But here God portrays the Medes and the Persians, that great empire, as a bear. Why would they come to that conclusion? They say, well, it moved kind of slowly. It was a big lumbering animal like a bear. It's a little tough to, I'm not trying to criticize people. I'm just saying, I think we have more light today. We have more information to draw from. The third one, it says, was like a leopard. Oh, leopards are fast, right? And what many of us fail to realize sometimes is Alexander the Great was, here, this man was, 27, 28 years old when he began as a general. 27 or 28 years old, he begins to conquer the world. By the time he's 31, that's 4 years. Now think about that. It took him 4 years to conquer the known world at that time. In fact, he dies of pneumonia in 332 BC in Babylon. He'd been outside. I forget what all happened. He was drunk, but he was in the rain or something. Anyhow, he was wet. It was cold. He caught, I guess you'd say, he caught a cold, and he didn't take care of himself, and he caught pneumonia. And a few days later, he died. But think about that. Think of how quickly Alexander was able to conquer from basically from Greece, from Macedonia, all the way out to the Great Wall of China. Process that. Try to process that on foot and on horses. That's how they did it. That's fast. So people will say, see, like a leopard, swift and powerful. Okay. And I'm not criticizing. Don't misunderstand what I'm doing here. But and I'm trying not to be dogmatic, so don't think that I am. But there are some things that are worth our consideration. And this is not brand new, but I will tell you that even, in fact, a great book for any of you who are interested, Sir Robert Anderson, The Coming Prince, great book on the book of Daniel. He wrote this in 1894. In fact, he was knighted for the work. Fantastic. And he deals with with all of Daniel's writings, but specifically he's dealing with chapter 9. That's where Sir Robert Anderson really shines. But on this chapter, he's one of the first ones I know of who ever said any of this. And he said, pretty much similar to what I'm saying, it's helpful what people have given us, but in reality, with the information he had at the time, he could see that these were other kingdoms, and there was another way of interpreting this passage. So, not trying to be dogmatic, but I do think it's worth our while to consider these things. So, this first beast we read was like a lion. It wasn't a lion, it looked like a lion, and it has eagle's wings in his vision. And he said, and I watched until its wings had been plucked off. And it was lifted up from the earth, and it was made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. I want to give you 4 ideas to think about before we go back now through these. Remember, traditional interpretation is that these 3 beasts are first Babylon, then Medo-Persia, then Greece, just like the head of gold, chest and arms of silver, and the belly and thighs of bronze in Neb's dream. Well, we're going to see in verse 12 that after the Antichrist, the little horn that Daniel refers to here is actually the one we would call Antichrist. I always like the way Chuck Missler used to put it. He used to say that the title that no one gives the Antichrist is the one he probably deserves more than anything else, and that would be Mr. Big Mouth, because he's often described, and I say it to you, you take note of it, and you'll see that you read this a lot. He's often referred to as speaking great things. In other words, he speaks of himself. He's very boastful. But that's what Daniel refers to, this little horn who speaks great things. But Antichrist is destroyed in verse 12. The lion, the bear, the leopard still exist. Well, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece, those kingdoms have fallen long before that, right? Here's another one in Daniel, chapter 7, in verse 17. These kingdoms, when these kingdoms arise, they're all future relative to Daniel's time. In fact, if you look very closely, the New King James doesn't capture it very well, but it's very clear in Aramaic. And I think you'll see it in NIV, you certainly see it in King James translation, that these are kingdoms that shall arise. So relative to Daniel, they had not yet existed. Okay? Also, these beasts are the very same beasts. Let's try this. In Daniel chapter 13, I'll just say it this way. I'm not going to keep reading these things because we don't have a lot of time. But look it up for yourself. In Revelation chapter 13, we read that John saw coming up out of the sea were a leopard, a bear, and a lion. Very interesting. Those are the exact same descriptors that Daniel uses, except that John gives them in reverse order of what Daniel saw. See, Daniel saw them as yet future. He saw one like a lion, followed by one like a bear, followed by one like a leopard. John was seeing them as having already occurred. He was in the day of the Lord. He saw these as having already occurred. So he sees them in reverse order. Just a thing to think about. But also, and this is an important one, if you're sensitive to what John says in Revelation 12 through 14, it's really one vision that John has in those 3 chapters. And he begins in chapter 12 of Revelation, speaking of, this woman, Israel, who brings forth a man-child who's Christ. So the birth of Christ, right? These kingdoms arise after. They come in chapter 13. They come after the birth of Christ. So they couldn't be Babylon, Persia, and Greece. Okay, I don't want to drag us down too much further. So now, 4 great beasts, let's look at these first 3, okay? They come from the Gentile nations. The first one is like a lion, in that it looked like a lion. It had eagle's wings, and then we read that the wings are plucked off of it, and then the lion stands up. He's able to stand up like a man on two legs. So let's think a bit about that. If we're not talking about Babylon, then what could it be? And this is, I think, Robert Anderson really helped me in terms of understanding some of this. Even from his perspective, he understood it back then. In 1707, Great Britain, when it officially became known as Great Britain, it took the symbol, the official symbol of Great Britain is the standing lion. The lion standing. And you look at it yourself. I think in some images it's actually 3 standing lions, but the standing lion, not just a lion, but a standing lion. In Daniel's vision, he sees a lion with eagle's wings. It's kind of interesting. But now if you think about it, here we have in 1776, the Americas, the American colonies, separate from Great Britain. You know, our image is of the bald eagle. And those eagle's wings, biblically, are taken off of the lion. Now, let's stop for a second and think about England. Most of us, we think of England today, and a lot of us just think of an island. It was not an island. At one time, in Great Britain's heyday, Great Britain was, well, actually, the old phrase is true, that they used to say the sun never sets on the British Empire. That was literally true. In other words, it was so vast, it stretched so many what we'd call time zones, that no matter what time of day it was, the sun was shining somewhere on a British colony or a British possession. That's not the case anymore, for a lot of reasons we're not going to go into tonight. They're very interesting and have much to do with how Great Britain treated England, how Great Britain treated Israel. But so think about this picture of the lion with eagle's wings. Now the eagle's wings are removed from it. Well, the USA. Who says the USA is not in Bible prophecy? Really, you never see America anywhere quite clearly described as being in biblical prophecy. But here, I believe, if this is true, the way I'm portraying it to you, then there's a hint here of the Americas, right? It says that he saw one like a lion with eagle's wings. Its wings were plucked off. It's lifted up from the earth, made to stand on 2 feet like a man. We see that in the symbol of Great Britain with the standing lion. And people debate about, a man's heart was given to it. Some say that at one time it was so voracious, it was just destroying everything everywhere, just taking in as much land and peoples as it could. But today it's more genteel. I don't know. I don't want to go too far in that. Again, I don't want to be dogmatic, so I'm not going to press that. Let's go on to the second beast. The second beast, he says, was like a bear. He says it was like a bear. It was raised up on one side, had 3 ribs in its mouth, between its teeth, and they said to it, "Arise and devour much flesh." Of course, you need to ask, who's they? We're not told who they are. But in any event, to arise and devour much flesh. Well, people have different opinions about the bear. But again, if we're going to take this alternate view, which, let's think a more modern view of these things. So a more modern view, we see the major influence of the British Empire and the Americas working together. Huge dominance. And think of the relationship that we've had with England, especially since World War I, World War II. We even worked together in the War on Terror. So now we talk about the bear. In other words, they're not necessarily successive. See, we have this idea that comes from chapter 2. These kingdoms will be successive. No. They were each different, but they all arose from the sea at the same time, the 3. So we have, you could say, hemispherically speaking, you have Great Britain and America working together. Now we have the bear. It's not like millennia. It's not like it's been for thousands of years that the bear has been the symbol of Russia. But in modern times, who's the bear? We all know that. That's the symbol that we would use for Russia. Modern-day Russia was actually reborn, you would say, in 1991 after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Actually, it's rebirth. It's the rebirth of the Soviet Socialist Republic in many ways. We see that now, especially with Putin in charge. And he's told, this bear is told to devour much flesh. There's a debate because no one really knows what the actual number is. But if you were to take Lenin and Stalin combined, their total, they're together, they're probably responsible for, at minimum, 30 million and upwards of 50 million deaths. By the way, that's what happens under communism. Somewhere between 30 and 50 million deaths. And that's just in terms of the growth of the Soviet Socialist Republic, let alone what they've done in their wars and their taking nations. So we have this bear here. And it's interesting, it talks about the three ribs. Now, again, it can't be dogmatic. Obviously, much of this can be speculative. But in terms of our understanding of what's happening in our world today, and what we understand from biblical prophecy, we have no time to get into a study of Ezekiel 38 and 39. But those of you who have an understanding of the basics of that prophecy, you understand the role of Russia in this, and particularly three nations that work with Russia in what's called the Magog invasion and coming to take a spoil in Israel. And those would be Iran, Turkey, the House of Togarmah. So Persia, the House of Togarmah, and also this other group over here called Gomer. Gomer, or we would probably say the Germanic peoples. So all of Germany probably would be fair to say, but certainly, if nothing else, Eastern Germany, Poland, and then extending into these other, ethnically Islamic nations, the Germanic people. So you have all of them plus Persia, Iran, etc., and Turkey working together. Those are the three ribs, you would say, then in the mouth of this bear. As it moves, it's powerful, devouring much flesh. So we have these two beasts. Here's a third one now, of course. We see the leopard. A lot of speculation, again, about this. Some would say the leopard is Germany. I don't think so. I'm not going to get into all the reasoning behind it because we don't have a lot of time, but I would suggest this. Well, where do you find a leopard? Another word, by the way, you could use leopard. Some Bible translations say panther. Well, where do you find leopards or panthers? Basically two areas. You find them in Asia and you find them in Africa. Couple different ways of looking at it, but let's read it here. What do we read? We read, after this I looked, verse 6, and there was another like a leopard. It's not saying it is a leopard, it's like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. And the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Okay, so like a leopard has 4 wings like a bird, and also has 4 heads. So those are 4 powers. And what is this leopard-like beast? Don't know. Can't be dogmatic. But certainly when we look at the world today and where we're headed and what's happening, we have the whole Euro, I want to be careful how I say Euro, but certainly Great Britain and America and Western Europe, right? Then we have the bear, the whole Russia, Iran, Turkey, Eastern Germanic peoples, and then the other side of the continent of the world. Someone's been in the news a lot, eh? China. Now, probably not just China alone, but China. And some of you might say, well, if it's China, why wouldn't God have just said it's a dragon? Well, because the dragon is a picture of Satan. That's probably the reason. But as you look at this and you look at what China has been doing, I think many of us are very familiar with what Napoleon had said about China. He said China's a sleeping giant. In other words, they're not having much impact on the world when Napoleon was there. But, he said, but when he awakes, He'll shake the world. And that's certainly what's happening and has been happening for sure in the last 30 years. For sure right now. China. You know, if you look at the Eastern peoples, right now we're about 7.8 billion people on planet Earth. You take just China and India combined. You have almost 3 billion people right there. It's estimated that by 2030, China and India combined will be 50% of the world's population, and at minimum 50 to 60% of the world's economic power. China is the great manufacturing center, really, of the world. And so it's a manufacturing economy, and India is a service economy. And you know, I mean, we joke about it. You call for help on your computer, you call the help desk, and you get someone in India, and you don't understand what they're saying. And, you know, we may joke about it, but there's a reason for that. It's very strategic. That's what both these nations have done. One is manufacturing, and the other is providing service. We have this kingdom like a leopard. It has 4 wings like a bird. It has 4 heads. Now, the wings could be a number of things. Again, I want to be careful. I say it over and over again. I don't want to be too dogmatic about this. But China has developed, particularly fast in its economic and strategic plans throughout particularly the Eastern world. But if you look at what they've done just on the 4 cardinal points of the map, to the north of China, they have developed military and economic ties with Russia. To the south, they are courting other Asian nations to work with them. To the east, they've worked at developing major economic partnerships with America, with Canada, with Mexico, Central and Southern and South America. So they've developed these major relationships. To the west, one of the things that a lot of people are not watching, but to the west, what China has been doing here now for easily the last 5-7 years, something like that, is developing partnerships and working especially with Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, and some others. They've been working on developing what's called the New Silk Road, or the Belt Road Initiative, developing also the Trans-Afghanistan pipeline, which takes into account or works with Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Pakistan, India, bringing or developing this gas line, the biggest, longest gas line of the world, stretching from Arabia out into Western China. So they are stretching in every possible direction, I would say, and they're doing it so quickly. That helps to support this idea of the 4 wings. Maybe there are other things, but those are the things that come to mind right now. China has also been doing a major work in developing, working with other regional nations in terms of arms sales and trade agreements, working with Myanmar, with India, with Pakistan, with Japan, with South Korea. There is no nation in the world that has a closer, more important relationship with North Korea than China themselves. And don't forget their plans as far as Taiwan and Hong Kong. So, but these 4 heads could also refer to simply when you consider the size of China, geographically and population-wise, just in terms of 4 regions they could develop within themselves, all speculative. Just stand back for a moment and understand the context. As you look at the context here in chapter 7, God has given Daniel a perspective on kingdoms that will, in the future is the point, and based upon a close reading, These kingdoms develop after the time of Christ. You with me? These kingdoms develop after the time of Christ and will have dominance and hegemony over all of the world. We are living, we just finished the most radical developmental century that the world's ever seen, the 20th century. Many of us, especially if you're a baby boomer, I mean, I'm in my 60s. I think of my parents, and certainly my grandfather, who knew a world that was nothing but horse-drawn or mule-drawn carts. And then to think of, even in his own lifetime, to see men walking on the moon and look at the technology that developed. Think of the things that my mom and dad saw in terms of technological development. There has been no century that the world's ever seen like these. You take that technology in that century and you combine it with what happened, particularly from the beginning of the 20th century, in terms of England and America, in terms of Russia, the bear, and these relationships, developing these relationships with these other nations, with China, the sleeping giant, arising. The world is set, the pieces are set on the chessboard for the fourth beast. And we're going to get into that fourth beast next week. But here's something for you. And hopefully, hopefully this has been interesting to you so far. Hopefully this has been provocative for you so far to say, oh, that's a very interesting way of applying this, because that fits for where we are. Yes, there's suddenly Bible prophecy. When you take that and you overlay that with the news of our world right now, you say, it's all happening right in front of our eyes. Absolutely. Interesting, one other thing about China, actually two other things, but this one first. Of all the nations of the world, it's China that has been very vocal, a real proponent of developing a global government, a global currency, and a global identification and tracking of all citizens. They're the ones who keep saying, this needs to be done, this needs to be done. We certainly have the technology, so do we, to do that. But here's a question. And it's sad, I know I said this on Sunday, it's sad how this whole COVID mess has divided all the peoples of really the earth. But it's divided the people in our nation, and most sadly has divided the body of Christ. What do you believe about masks? What do you believe about vaccine, being vaccinated? And I'll say, before I say this next thing, we need to show love and grace to one another. If you don't want to receive the vaccine, that's your choice. That's a Romans 14 choice. It's not a biblical issue per se. If you believe that you're in a situation and you need to receive the vaccine, take the vaccine. It's not my business whether you do or don't. So whether you do or whether you don't shouldn't be an issue, but sadly it's divided the body of Christ. And I'm speaking as the pastor here. Let it not divide us. Having said that, I'm going to say something which may be divisive, but I want you to think about this. Could it be, especially based on what we've just read in chapter 7, we've only gone through a few verses, we'll finish the rest of the chapter next week, but could it be that China worked with the globalists to develop COVID-19 rather than see China as the enemy? I think we all know, if we're paying attention to what's going on in the world, you look at the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, the globalists really do control what's happening in this world. Not President Trump didn't control it. Bibi Netanyahu didn't control it. Joe Biden doesn't control it. We act like it does because the news makes us think that. But the globalists are the ones who really are in control of what's going on in our world right now. Could it be that China, at the behest of the globalists, that China developed COVID-19 and released it in late 2019 in order to prepare the world population to receive vaccines, in order that, as time goes on, in order to ultimately accept some form of global identification and global tracking system. I'm not saying the vaccine is an identifier or a tracking system. It may be. It may have some technology I really don't understand. But that all the world now is flocking to this vaccine. Could it be that the globalists worked with China to develop that? And for that matter, could it be that the globalists worked with China to do this in order ultimately to help bring down two very powerful nationalistic governments? President Trump and those who loved him, to bring down his influence, and Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. Israel and the United States are two very major powers that are thorns in the side of the globalist agenda in this world. It was made very clear back in late December of 2020 that the World Economic Forum said we are going to suspend what they call the Great Reset in 2021 while the world is dealing with COVID and receiving the vaccine, and we will start again in 2022. They've set the stage. They've already told us the Great Reset is coming. Most of us would rather stick our heads in the hole and ignore it all. But it's coming. The Great Reset is coming. They've already made it clear. That's not a conspiracy theory. They've made it clear. I say those things not to stir up trouble, but to ask us to think about those things. And so, as I said in the beginning, I know that very often prophecy is much like driving cross country and knowing the mountains are out there, but you just can't see them yet. Or you see a little line across the horizon. Well, that little line is no longer so little. It's grown bigger and bigger in front of us, and we're very close. We're at the front range. We're starting our way up the foothills now. Jesus Christ is coming back very soon, and he has called us to stop business as usual, to be sure that we're following him in every step, in the walk of our lives. It's time for us to get serious about the work he's called us to share the gospel, to be the church, not to be a social institution, but to be the church of Jesus Christ, the body of Christ. Please read ahead. I urge you to read the chapters that I suggested, Isaiah 13, 14, Jeremiah 50 and 51, Revelation 17 and 18, in terms of Babylon. The things we'll be looking at in chapter 7 through the end of this book, chapter 12, will remind those of us who already know the book of Daniel, remind us how close is the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. And those of us who don't know the book well, as we study it, we're going to be encouraged to be the church and to understand just how close is the rapture of the body. I'm looking forward to that day, my friends, and I hope you are too. Thanks for spending time with me tonight, and I'll see you on Sunday. God bless you all. Good night.